A strange thing has happened in modern politics. The word far right used to carry a heavy meaning. It pointed toward movements that were shaped by racial supremacy, authoritarian nostalgia, fascist symbols, violent nationalism, and open hostility toward minority groups. It was not a casual insult, it named real political danger. But today, that meaning has become blurred. A label can now be thrown at a parent questioning school policy, a religious voter defending traditional marriage, a worker angry about globalism, a rural community suspicious of elite institutions, or someone worried about immigration and cultural change. Once that happens, the word no longer only identifies extremism, it begins to function as a weapon of shutting down uncomfortable political concerns. That shift matters because serious moral language depends on precision. When a heavy accusation is used too casually, the public can no longer tell whether the word names a genuine threat or merely expresses political dislike. And when every conservative anxiety is treated as fascism, real fascism becomes harder to identify. This does not mean that extremist politics should be excused. Movements that trade in racism, authoritarianism, conspiracy, religious hatred, misogyny, political violence, and contempt for democratic life must be confronted with moral clarity, because a society that cannot name danger eventually becomes vulnerable to that exact danger it refuses to name. But moral clarity is not the same thing as demonization, because moral clarity names danger with precision. It asks what is actually being said, who is being harmed, what history is being invoked, what policy is being defended, and what kind of society is being imagined. Demonization, on the other hand, does something easier. It skips the hard work of judgment and simply declares these people are dangerous, hateful, and beyond conversion. That shortcut may feel righteous, especially in a political culture addicted to public condemnation. But it carries a serious cost, because people rarely abandon their fears simply because they are mocked for having them. More often, they carry those fears into darker rooms, harder movements, and more radical communities willing to say, you were right, they hate you, they will never listen, come to our side. That is how careless labeling can become a recruitment ground. A democracy cannot survive when every disagreement becomes a form of moral exile, because citizens who feel permanently condemned do not simply disappear. Some of them go silent, some of them go resentful, others become drawn to leaders who promise revenge against the elites who humiliated them. This is why humiliation is one of the most dangerous political emotions in the world today. It turns wounded identity into political fuel. Scripture understands this power of speech better, because in the book of Proverbs 15, verses 1, it says, a soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. That is not sentimental advice for private life only. It is political wisdom, because the way a society speaks about its opponent can either cool anger or turn civic tensions into a hot, burning fire. James chapter 3 gives even a sharper warning, saying, the tongue, though small, can set a forest ablaze. That image matters because political language does not remain language for long. Words become suspicion, suspicion becomes resentment, resentment becomes hostility, and hostility eventually reshapes public life. A society that speaks carelessly about its opponent should not be shocked when the civic life becomes combustible. This does not mean hateful ideas should be handled gently. It means people must be addressed truthfully, not lazily. A person worried about cultural change is not automatically a fascist. A person opposed to mass immigration is not automatically a white supremacist. A person defending religious tradition is not automatically a theocrat. A person angry at liberal elites is not automatically a threat to democracy. But someone calling for racial hierarchy, political violence, ethnic cleansing, dictatorship, or any form of dehumanization against minorities must be confronted without hesitation, because there's a difference between political anxiety and political evil. That difference is exactly what modern politics is losing. Hannah Arendt's warning about totalitarian movement becomes important here because she understood how loneliness, propaganda, resentment, and powerlessness can make people vulnerable to dangerous politics. Alienated people do not become less alienated when respectable society mocks them. Many become easier to capture because extremist movements are skilled at turning rejection into identity. If a person already feels ignored, humiliated, or displaced, public shame may not pull them back toward moderation. It may confirm the very story extremists are telling them, that the system hates them, that elites despise them, and that only radical politics will defend them. This is why careless demonization can do more harm than good. It turns politics into a purity ritual where the goal is no longer persuasion, truth, or justice, but the satisfaction of public condemnation. It allows the comfortable to feel morally clean while leaving the social wound untreated. And untreated wounds ultimately do not vanish. They infect and they spread wider. There's a theological danger here because demonization tempts people to confuse the person with the sin. Christian moral thought at its best refuses that confusion. It can condemn injustice fiercely while still insisting that a human being remains more than their worst political temptation. Genesis chapter 1 verses 27 grounds human dignity in the image of God, which means that dignity is not erased because someone is angry, fearful, misled, prejudiced, or politically wrong. Augustine makes a similar distinction when he warns against hating the person rather than the vice. That distinction matters because once a society begins to treat people as demons, it becomes easier to justify cruelty against them. That is not moral conviction, that is moral arrogance wearing religious clothing. The Islamic tradition carries a similar warning against injustice in speech. The Quran condemns ridicule, suspicion, backbiting, and false witness, while also calling believers to stand firm for justice, even when justice cuts against personal interests, family loyalty, or tribal belonging. This means truthful naming is not optional. It is a moral duty which cuts across. If an idea is racist, call it racist. If a movement is authoritarian, call it authoritarianism. If a policy endangers vulnerable people, say so. If a political figure borrows from fascist nostalgia, name it clearly. But if someone is simply conservative, religious, culturally anxious, economically displaced, or skeptical of progressive ideology, calling them far-right may not be courage. It may be intellectual laziness. Calling them far-right may not be courage. It may be simply intellectual laziness that is dressed within the guise of righteousness. Still yet, caution must cut across both sides, because careless labeling is dangerous, but so is pretending that far-right politics is always imaginary. History has already shown what happens when societies underestimate extremist movements. Fascism did not arrive announcing itself as evil. It often came dressed in the language of national renewal, moral restoration, wounded pride, cultural purity, and protection for ordinary people against corrupt elite. That language still has power today because extremist movements rarely begin by saying, we want cruelty. They begin by taking real suffering and redirecting it toward scapegoats. Economic pain then becomes hatred of immigrants. Cultural anxiety becomes contempt for minorities. Religious conviction becomes domination. Patriotism becomes ethnic idolatry. Masculine insecurity becomes misogyny. Distrust of elites becomes conspiracy. Fear becomes a political weapon. A society that refuses to name those patterns becomes complicit in their growth. That is why the answer cannot be self-denial. There are people who say, stop demonizing the far right, when what they really mean is stop criticizing bigotry. That must be rejected. Civility must never become a hiding place for injustice. Dialogue must never mean giving violent ideologies a respectable platform. Compassion for alienated persons must not become softness toward a movement that endangers the vulnerable. The line must be drawn clearly. No racial supremacy, no political violence, no dehumanization, no authoritarian worship, no nostalgia for fascism, no religious hatred, no treating minorities as contaminants in the body politic. A society has the right to define its moral boundaries, but those boundaries must be drawn with exact precision. Once the boundary expands so widely that half of the population is treated as irredeemable, democracy then becomes impossible. Because you cannot share a country with people you have trained yourself to see only as demons. This is where the argument becomes most serious. The greatest harm of demonization is not that it hurts the feeling of people called far-right. The deeper danger is that it weakens society's moral intelligence. It makes people less able to distinguish between the conservative, the reactionary, the populist, the nationalist, the authoritarian, the racist, and the fascist. Those are not the same thing. When they are treated as identical, public language becomes blunt. A blunt language becomes dangerous in a delicate political moment. A doctor who calls every illness cancer is not being vigilant. He is becoming useless. The same applies to politics. If every disliked position is called far-right, the term stops being diagnosing. It starts branding, and branding is not analysis. The better path is not silence. It is a sharper speech. Name racism where it exists. Name authoritarianism where it appears. Name conspiracy when it corrodes truth. Name cruelty when it targets the weak. Name fascist nostalgia when it borrows symbols, myths, and methods from history's darkest chapters. But do not use the strongest words for every opponent, because moral language loses force when it is inflated beyond recognition. A society that wastes its warning may find that nobody listening when the real danger arrives. There's also a practical reason for restraint. Persuasion requires leading people a road back. If someone is drawn toward extreme politics through fear, loneliness, unemployment, cultural displacement, or distrust, public shaming them may harden them. Careful engagement may not always work. Some people choose hatred and cling to it. Some movement must be defeated, not gently persuaded. But many people are not committed extremists. They are politically homeless, angry, confused, suspicious, wounded, or afraid. Treating all of them as enemies may satisfy those already convinced of their own righteousness, but it will not heal the country. Real hardship does not flatter extremism, but it also does not outsource moral reasoning to slogans. It listens without surrendering truth. It condemns without dehumanizing. It protects the vulnerable without turning politics into permanent civil war. That is the balance modern democracy desperately needs. The demonization of far-right politics has done more harm than good when it becomes careless, inflated, and indiscriminate because it drives alienated citizens deeper into radical spaces, weakens democratic conversations, and cheapens moral language that makes real extremism harder to identify. But refusing demonization must never become refusing discernment. The answer is not to normalize the far right. The answer, however, is to recover the discipline of truth and the naming of truth, because democracy does not need softer lies. It needs sharper truth. Whatever needs to be said and done must be done, because sharper truths knows the difference between a neighbor who's afraid, a citizen who's angry, a conservative who disagrees, and a movement that would burn the house completely.